My husband demanded I return to work 1 week after giving birth. I worked as a financial analyst at a firm downtown making good money before I had our daughter Ella. My husband Shane worked at the same company in sales, and that's how we met 5 years ago. We agreed before getting married that when we had kids, I'd take the standard 12 weeks maternity leave my company offered, and Shane would take 2 weeks to help out. We even saved up extra money so we wouldn't stress about the temporary pay cut. Everything was planned perfectly until Ella actually arrived. The delivery was rough, and I needed an emergency C-section after 20 hours of labor. I lost a lot of blood and could barely walk for days. Shane was there for the birth but went back to work 3 days later saying he needed to save his time off for when I really needed help. I was still in the hospital when he said this. On day 5, Shane came to pick us up and started talking about household expenses on the drive home. He said we needed to rethink our budget because his commission was down that month. I reminded him we had savings specifically for this. He said that money was for emergencies, not for me to lounge around. I couldn't believe he said that while I was holding our newborn with fresh surgical stitches across my abdomen. Day 7, exactly 1 week after Ella was born, Shane woke me up at 6 in the morning dressed for work. He said it was time for me to get back to the office. I thought he was joking, but he was dead serious. He said women in other countries went back to work immediately after giving birth. He said his grandmother had 6 kids and never missed a day of farm work. He said I was being lazy and using the baby as an excuse to avoid responsibilities. I literally still had a catheter from complications, and he wanted me at a desk doing spreadsheets. I told him the doctor said I needed 8 weeks minimum to heal from the C-section. Shane said doctors just wanted to bill more appointments, and I was fine. He brought me my work laptop and said I could at least work from bed if I was going to be difficult about going to the office. I was breastfeeding Ella when he said this. My mom came over that afternoon and found me crying while trying to type one-handed while pumping. She called Shane and tore into him, but he told her I was being hormonal and overreacting to a simple request to contribute to our household. He actually used the word contribute like I hadn't just created a human being. By week 2, Shane was getting worse. He'd wake me up every morning asking if I was going to work. He'd calculate how much money we were losing each day I stayed home. He'd bring me job listings for work-from-home positions that started immediately. He told his mother I was refusing to work, and she called me selfish. He told his coworkers I was milking the system, and his boss made a joke about it when I called to extend my leave. He even suggested I could bring Ella to the office and work while she slept. When I pointed out that was insane, he said I was making excuses. Week 3, Shane did something unforgivable. He called my boss and told him I was ready to come back early. My boss was confused, but Shane said I was just too proud to admit I was bored at home. My boss called me excited to have me back, and I had to explain I was still recovering from major surgery. Shane had made me look unprofessional, and my boss sounded irritated when he realized Shane had lied. That's when I decided Shane needed education about childbirth recovery. I started leaving medical articles about C-sections on his pillow. He'd throw them away without reading. I had my doctor call him to explain the healing process. He said the doctor was exaggerating. I showed him my still bleeding incision. He said it looked fine to him. So I got creative. I signed Shane up for a childbirth simulation class that companies use for sensitivity training. I told him it was a couples bonding experience and he needed to support me by trying it. Shane showed up thinking it was a parenting class. The instructor strapped electrodes to his abdomen to simulate contractions. Shane lasted 4 minutes before begging them to stop. The instructor said most women endure that for 15 to 20 hours. Shane said that was different because women were built for it. The instructor then put him in a compression vest to simulate the weight and pressure of pregnancy. Shane complained after 10 minutes that his back hurt and he couldn't breathe properly. The instructor reminded him women deal with that for 9 months while working. Then came the best part. The instructor had Shane wear a belt that simulated the abdominal separation that happens during C-sections. Every movement pulled at the belt like stitches pulling at skin. Shane couldn't sit up without help. He couldn't lift anything. He couldn't even laugh without pain. The instructor told him to imagine doing that while caring for a newborn and having someone demand you return to work. Shane went pale and threw up. I stayed frozen in my spot watching Shane hunched over a trash can, while Hannah kept her hand on his shoulder. She explained that the belt he wore simulated only the surface pain of an incision, not the deep muscle trauma or the internal healing that takes weeks. She told him most women pushed through this exact feeling while lifting babies, climbing stairs, and being told their recovery was taking too long. Shane wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and looked up at me with something different in his face. His eyes were wet, and his expression had changed from the defensive anger I'd seen for 3 weeks. He started to say something that sounded like an apology, but I turned away and gathered my things. Words came easy when someone felt guilty in the moment. I needed to see if anything actually changed when we got home, and he wasn't wearing a simulation belt anymore. The drive back to our house felt endless, even though it only took 20 minutes. Ella fussed in her car seat the whole time, making those pre-cry noises that meant she'd be screaming soon. Shane kept glancing over at me and then wincing when he shifted in his seat. The simulation belt was off, but Hannah said the soreness would last for hours, maybe into tomorrow. That was exactly her point when she designed the program. She wanted partners to remember the pain long enough to connect it to real recovery. Every time Shane moved wrong and his face tensed up, I thought about how I'd been moving like that for 3 weeks while he told me I was being lazy. We pulled into the driveway and Shane got out slowly, one hand pressed to his lower back. He grabbed the diaper bag from the trunk and carried it inside without complaining, which was new. Usually he'd make comments about how heavy it was, or ask why we needed so much stuff just to leave the house. That night, something shifted in our routine. Ella woke up around midnight crying, and I heard Shane get out of bed before I could even sit up. He went to her room and I listened to him talking softly while he changed her diaper. His movement sounded careful and slow through the baby monitor. He brought her to me for feeding, and I could see him moving like his stomach hurt. After Ella finished eating, Shane took her back to her crib and got her settled without asking me to do it. 3 hours later, when Ella woke up again, the same thing happened. Shane got up, changed her, brought her to me, then took her back. He didn't complain once or make comments about being tired. He just did it, moving slowly the whole time like his abdomen was actually hurting him. Morning came too early like it always did with a newborn. I woke up to find Shane's side of the bed empty and heard him on the phone in the kitchen. He was calling his work saying he needed a sick day. I walked out holding my incision area because mornings were still rough, and found Shane making coffee with one hand pressed to his back. He told me his back was killing him from that pregnancy weight vest, and he needed a day to recover. He said it completely serious, like he didn't hear what he was actually saying. I just stared at him for a minute. He'd spent 3 weeks telling me to go back to work while I was bleeding and healing from major surgery, and now he needed a whole day off because his back hurt from wearing a vest for an hour. I pointed this out very directly. I told him he was taking a sick day for back pain from a 1-hour simulation, while I'd been begging for recovery time for 3 weeks after actual surgery. Shane's face went red and he looked down at his coffee. He admitted he had no idea how physically hard this all was. He said he genuinely didn't understand why I couldn't just push through it and get back to normal. Then he added that his grandmother had 6 kids and worked through everything, so he figured I could too. I felt my jaw tighten. His grandmother's supposed superhuman recovery had been his excuse for 3 weeks of cruelty. I told him that maybe his grandmother had help he didn't know about, or maybe she was in pain the whole time and just didn't complain, or maybe the story was exaggerated. Shane didn't have an answer for that. My mom called mid-morning to check in. I told her about the simulation class and how Shane threw up from the C-section belt. She laughed in that satisfied way that meant she was glad someone finally got through to him. But then her voice got serious. She said one good day didn't erase 3 weeks of him treating me like garbage while I was bleeding and vulnerable. She warned me not to let my guard down too fast, just because Shane was being decent for once. She reminded me that people often acted better when they felt guilty, but the real test was whether the change lasted after the guilt faded. I knew she was right. Shane's temporary soreness would be gone in a day or two, and then we'd see if he remembered any of this. Shane spent the rest of the day on his laptop researching C-section recovery. He should have done this 3 weeks ago before demanding I go back to work, but at least he was doing it now. He kept reading facts out loud like he was discovering shocking information. He learned that the surgery cuts through 7 layers of tissue and muscle. He read that internal healing takes 6 to 8 weeks minimum. He found out that lifting anything heavier than the baby can cause complications. He discovered that some women have nerve damage that never fully heals. With each new fact, Shane got quieter. He kept glancing at me and then back at his screen. I could see him putting together how badly he'd been treating me. He was realizing that when he told me to work from bed while pumping, I was dealing with internal wounds and muscle separation. When he said I looked fine, my body was literally still knitting itself back together inside. By evening, Shane closed his laptop and turned to face me. He attempted what sounded like a real apology this time, not the quick sorry he'd tried at the simulation center. He explained he genuinely thought I was exaggerating my pain and recovery needs. He said his mother had easy births with him and his brothers, and she always talked about how women nowadays were too soft. He admitted he let his mom's opinions override medical facts and his own wife's experience. He said he was wrong and he should have listened to me and my doctor instead of comparing me to his grandmother's farm wife stories. His voice cracked a little when he talked about how he'd made me feel, and I could tell he meant it in this moment. I looked at Shane sitting there with his guilty face and his sore back and told him the truth. Understanding now didn't undo 3 weeks of harassment while I was bleeding and healing. He made me feel worthless and lazy during the most vulnerable time of my life. He told his coworkers I was milking the system. He called my boss behind my back. He brought me my work laptop while I was breastfeeding with fresh surgical stitches. He compared me to his grandmother while I still had a catheter from complications. I told him that wasn't something a single apology could fix, no matter how sincere he was feeling right now. Shane nodded and his eyes were wet again. He asked what he could do to make this right, and I could tell he wanted a simple answer that would solve everything quickly. I told him he could start by calling my boss tomorrow to apologize for lying about me being ready to return early. Then he needed to call his mother and tell her to stop calling me selfish. Shane nodded slowly and asked if that would be enough. I said it was a start, but I'd be watching to see if he actually followed through. He looked exhausted sitting there on the couch with his shoulders slumped. Part of me felt bad for him, but a bigger part remembered 3 weeks of harassment while I was bleeding and trying to keep a newborn alive. I got up carefully to check on Ella, who was sleeping in her bassinet. My incision pulled when I stood and I had to move slowly. Shane noticed and offered to get her, but I told him I could manage. I needed him to see that even simple movements still hurt me 4 weeks after surgery. The next morning, I woke up to Shane already dressed and drinking coffee at the kitchen table. He had his phone in front of him and kept picking it up, then putting it down. I fed Ella and waited to see if he'd actually make the calls. Around 9, he finally dialed and I heard him ask for my boss. His voice was quiet, but I could hear him say he needed to apologize for calling last week. He explained he was completely wrong and that I needed my full medical leave. He said he'd been ignorant about C-section recovery and had no right to speak for me. My boss must have said something because Shane went quiet for a minute. Then Shane said he understood if this affected how people saw me professionally, and that was his fault entirely. He promised it wouldn't happen again. When he hung up, his hands were shaking slightly. I asked how it went, and Shane said my boss was professional but clearly annoyed. He'd assured Shane that my job was secure and I should take the full 12 weeks as originally planned. But Shane could tell from his tone that the whole situation had created workplace drama that reflected badly on me. I felt anger rise up because this was exactly what I'd been afraid of. Shane had made me look unprofessional and unreliable to my boss and coworkers. Even though he'd apologized, the damage was already done. People at work would remember that my husband called to lie about my readiness to return. They'd wonder about our relationship and whether I was reliable. Shane saw my face and said he was sorry, but sorry didn't fix my reputation. He made the second call right after. I listened to him tell his mother that she needed to respect my recovery and stop undermining me. His voice was firmer this time, and when his mother apparently tried to argue, he cut her off. He said calling me selfish was unacceptable and she needed to apologize. His mother must have pushed back because Shane's jaw tightened. He told her that if she couldn't be supportive, she wouldn't be seeing Ella anytime soon. Then he hung up without saying goodbye. He looked at me and said his mother didn't take it well, but he'd said what needed saying. 20 minutes later, my phone rang with Shane's mother's number. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. She started talking immediately about how I'd turned her son against family. She said I was manipulating him with medical excuses and making him choose between his wife and his mother. She called me selfish again and said women in her generation didn't act this way about childbirth. She said I was weak and lazy and using the baby to control Shane. I tried to interrupt, but she kept going. She said Shane had always been a good son until he married me. She said I was destroying their family and she wouldn't stand for it. Her voice got louder and I could hear the anger and blame in every word. She clearly hadn't learned anything from Shane's conversation with her. I hung up without responding and immediately blocked her number. Shane came into the room asking who called, and I told him I'd blocked his mother. He looked surprised and asked why. I said I was done being harassed during recovery and he needed to handle his mother himself. Protecting me and Ella was his job now, not mine. If his mother wanted to be part of our lives, she needed to show basic respect, and that wasn't my responsibility to teach her. Shane nodded and said he understood. He looked tired and sad, but he agreed that I shouldn't have to deal with his mother's attacks while trying to heal. Over the next 2 days, Shane continued helping with Ella and doing household tasks. But I noticed something that worried me. He was moving normally again. His back didn't hurt anymore from the simulation vest. He could sit up and stand without wincing. The belt that mimicked C-section pain was long gone, and his temporary discomfort had completely disappeared. Meanwhile, I was still struggling with stairs 4 weeks after giving birth. I still couldn't lift anything heavy without pain. I still needed help getting up from low chairs. The empathy Shane gained from the simulation was already fading as his body returned to normal, and mine continued healing slowly. I made an appointment with my doctor for my 4-week checkup and told Shane he was coming with me. He started to say he had a meeting at work, but I cut him off. I said he needed to hear directly from medical professionals about my healing progress and what I still couldn't physically do. He needed to understand this wasn't over just because his temporary soreness had disappeared. Shane agreed without arguing, which was progress, but I could tell he thought the appointment was unnecessary. He probably figured I was mostly healed by now since he felt fine. The appointment was on a Thursday morning, and Shane drove us to the medical building downtown. We brought Ella in her car seat, and Shane carried her while I walked slowly beside them. The waiting room had other new moms, and I saw Shane looking around at them like he was trying to figure out which ones had C-sections. The nurse called my name, and we followed her back to the exam room. My doctor came in and greeted Shane by name, which made him uncomfortable. She asked how I was feeling, and I was honest about still having pain with certain movements and struggling with fatigue. My doctor had me lie back and lifted my shirt to examine my incision. She pressed gently around the area and asked about tenderness. I told her it still hurt when I twisted or lifted anything. She nodded and had me sit up, then turned to Shane. She explained I still had significant internal healing needed, even though the external incision looked good. She pulled up diagrams on her computer showing abdominal muscle separation and the layers of tissue that had been cut during surgery. She told Shane most women need 8 to 12 weeks before returning to normal activities, and some take even longer. She said my body was doing exactly what it should, but healing wasn't linear or quick. Shane asked if working from home would be okay at this point. My doctor turned to look at him with an expression I can only describe as shocked disbelief. She said absolutely not. She explained I needed rest, not laptop time while breastfeeding. She said she was actually concerned about my blood pressure from stress and adding work would make everything worse. She told Shane that pushing me to work before medical clearance could cause complications, including infection or delayed healing. Her tone was sharp and professional, but I could tell she was frustrated with him. Shane's face went red and he mumbled something about just asking. After examining me and checking Ella, my doctor asked if she could speak with me privately for a moment. Shane took Ella out to the waiting room looking embarrassed. Once he was gone, my doctor asked directly if I felt safe at home. The question caught me off guard, but I appreciated her asking. I told her the truth. Shane had been pressuring me badly for 3 weeks, but he was improving after some education. I said I wasn't sure if the change would last or if it was just temporary guilt. My doctor wrote something in my chart and gave me resources for postpartum support. She said if things got worse, I should call immediately. She also said she'd documented our conversation, including Shane's question about working from home. Her message was clear without being said out loud. She was watching this situation and would intervene if needed. I walked back to the waiting room where Shane sat holding Ella's car seat. He looked up when I came through the door and I could see the question in his eyes, but I didn't feel like talking about it yet. We loaded Ella into the car and Shane started driving toward home, his hands tight on the steering wheel. He kept glancing at me sideways like he wanted to say something but wasn't sure how to start. Finally, he cleared his throat and said the doctor seemed really concerned. I told him yes, she was concerned because his behavior had been awful. Shane's face went red and he started explaining that he wasn't trying to control me. He was just worried about money and our future. I pulled out my phone and opened our banking app without saying anything. I showed him the savings account we'd set up specifically for my maternity leave. The balance was more than enough to cover 12 weeks of reduced income. Shane stared at the numbers and his mouth opened, but no sound came out. I asked him if he still thought money was the real issue, or if he wanted to admit what this was actually about. He drove in silence for another few minutes before pulling into our driveway. We sat in the car with the engine off and Ella sleeping peacefully in the back seat. Shane finally said he didn't know why he'd been acting this way. I told him that wasn't good enough because his behavior had consequences and I needed real answers. That night, after I put Ella down for what would probably be a short sleep, I got our laptop and opened a spreadsheet. Shane came into the bedroom and asked what I was doing. I told him we were going through our finances together so he could see exactly how wrong he'd been about the money situation. I pulled up our monthly expenses and income, our savings accounts, and the maternity leave budget we'd created before Ella was born. Every number proved we were fine financially. Shane sat on the edge of the bed watching me scroll through the data and his shoulders slumped lower with each screen. I showed him we had enough savings to cover 6 months of expenses if needed, not just the 3 months of reduced income from my leave. He had no response when I asked him again if money was really the problem. The silence stretched between us until Ella started crying from her bassinet. Shane got up to check on her and I heard him changing her diaper in the nursery, moving slowly like he was thinking hard about something. When he came back with Ella for her feeding, Shane sat in the chair across from our bed instead of next to me like he usually did. He watched me get Ella latched and then said something I wasn't expecting. He admitted he'd felt abandoned when Ella was born. He said it felt like I suddenly cared more about the baby than about him and our marriage. He resented how all my attention went to Ella, and he wanted things to go back to normal as fast as possible. I stared at him while Ella nursed and felt anger rising in my chest. I told him those feelings might be normal for new parents, but taking them out on me while I was recovering from major surgery was cruel and selfish. He needed to talk about feeling overwhelmed instead of punishing me for having medical needs and a newborn to care for. Shane's eyes filled with tears and he said he knew that now, but he hadn't understood it before. He said watching me with Ella made him feel invisible and unimportant. I shifted Ella to my other side and told Shane that his feelings of adjustment were normal, but his actions had been completely wrong. We stayed up talking after I put Ella back down around midnight. Shane admitted things I don't think he'd ever said out loud before. He said he'd expected everything to continue basically the same after we had a baby, like Ella would just fit into our existing life without changing much. He thought I'd take a few weeks off and then we'd get back to our normal routine with a baby added in. I asked him how he possibly thought that would work. He looked embarrassed and said he honestly hadn't thought about it much beyond the basic logistics. His parents had raised 4 kids and his mom always said it wasn't that hard if you just stayed organized. I pointed out his mom had been a stay-at-home parent, which was completely different from both of us working full-time. Shane nodded slowly like this was occurring to him for the first time. I told him we needed to have a real conversation about dividing up the work, because I couldn't do everything while also recovering and breastfeeding. Shane agreed and said he wanted to help more, but he didn't always know what needed to be done. We spent the next hour making lists of all the tasks involved in keeping Ella alive and our household running. Shane seemed genuinely shocked by how long the list got. Feeding every 2 to 3 hours, diaper changes at least 8 times a day, laundry that never ended, dishes that piled up constantly, cleaning bottles and pump parts, grocery shopping, cooking meals, paying bills, and somehow finding time to sleep. I told him this was what I'd been managing while my incision was still bleeding, and he'd been demanding I add a full-time job to the list. Shane put his head in his hands and said he'd been an idiot. I agreed, but told him being an idiot wasn't the same as fixing the problem. We needed actual help, and I thought we should try couples counseling. Shane's head jerked up, and he said we could work this out ourselves without getting other people involved. I told him it was counseling, or I was packing up Ella and staying at my mom's house until he figured out whether he wanted to be a partner or not. Shane argued for a few minutes about how counseling was expensive, and we didn't need strangers in our business. I reminded him we had plenty of money saved and our business was already a mess, so outside help seemed smart. He finally agreed when I stood up and started pulling clothes out of my dresser. I called my mom the next morning while Shane was at work and Ella was napping. She answered on the second ring, and I told her everything that had happened at the doctor's office and our conversation afterward. My mom was quiet for a moment and then said she was proud of me for standing up to Shane, but worried about whether his changes would last. She said she knew someone who might be able to help us. Her friend's daughter had gone through something similar after having twins and worked with a counselor named Raphael Steele, who specialized in postpartum relationship problems. I wrote down his information and called his office that afternoon. The receptionist said they had an opening the following week on Tuesday morning. I took it and told Shane about the appointment when he got home. The next few days were different in our house. Shane started getting up with Ella for her middle-of-the-night diaper changes without me asking. He did 3 loads of laundry on Saturday and cooked simple dinners on Sunday and Monday. I watched him struggle with figuring out Ella's sleep schedule and when she needed to eat versus when she was just fussy. He looked exhausted by Tuesday morning, and I realized he was getting a tiny glimpse of what I'd been dealing with for 5 weeks, while also healing from surgery. On Wednesday, Shane took a half day at work to stay home and help with Ella. He changed her, fed her bottles of pumped milk, and tried to get her to nap. By the time I came back from a quick trip to the store, Shane was sitting on the couch looking defeated with Ella crying in his arms. He said he didn't understand how I made this look easy because everything took forever and nothing stayed done. I took Ella from him and got her calmed down while Shane slumped against the cushions. During week 5 postpartum, I noticed Shane was consistently doing more around the house. He handled all the nighttime diaper changes, washed and folded every load of laundry, and made basic meals like pasta and sandwiches. He still looked overwhelmed by how much work it all was. I caught him staring at the pile of clean bottles that needed to be put away, like he couldn't believe they'd all be dirty again in a few hours. He started really understanding the repetitive nature of taking care of a baby. The feeding schedule that never changed. The constant cycle of dirty clothes and dirty dishes. The way nothing ever stayed clean or organized for more than 20 minutes. One morning he said he finally got why I'd been so frustrated when he kept asking me to add work to everything else. I told him this was still just a fraction of what I'd been managing, because he wasn't dealing with surgical pain and breastfeeding exhaustion on top of the baby care. Shane nodded and said he was starting to understand how badly he'd messed up. On Thursday afternoon, the doorbell rang while Shane was in the basement switching laundry from the washer to the dryer. I was feeding Ella in the nursery and heard him come up the stairs and open the front door. Miles from Shane's sales team stood on the porch holding a wrapped gift box with a big yellow bow on top. I could hear their conversation from where I sat with Ella latched on and nursing. Miles sounded confused, asking why Shane was home at 2 in the afternoon on a workday. Shane explained he'd been taking half days for the past week to help out more with the baby and household stuff. Miles made a comment about Shane looking completely exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. Shane laughed, but it sounded tired, and admitted the baby care was way harder than he expected. They talked for a few more minutes before Miles handed over the gift and left. Shane brought the box upstairs and set it on the changing table, then sat down heavily in the rocking chair across from where I was feeding Ella. He rubbed his face with both hands and just sat there looking worn out. After Miles drove away, Shane turned to me and said he was tired all the time now. He said he didn't understand how I'd been managing all of this alone while also recovering from major surgery. I shifted Ella to my other side and reminded him I'd been telling him exactly this for 5 weeks straight. He nodded slowly and said he knew, but he didn't actually believe me until he started doing it himself. He thought I was exaggerating or being dramatic about how much work it took. Now he understood the feeding schedule never stopped. The laundry piled up faster than he could wash it, and every single task took 3 times longer than it should, because Ella needed something right in the middle of it. I told him this was still just a small piece of what I'd been dealing with because he wasn't recovering from having his abdomen cut open. Shane looked down at his hands and said he was sorry for not believing me sooner. Tuesday morning came and we drove to Raphael's office for our first counseling session. The waiting room had comfortable chairs and magazines nobody ever read. A receptionist called us back after 10 minutes and led us down a hallway to Raphael's office. He was a man in his 40s with gray starting at his temples and a calm way of speaking that made the room feel quieter. We sat on a couch across from his chair and he started by asking us to explain why we were there. Shane immediately tried to downplay what happened, saying we'd had some disagreements about my maternity leave but were working through it now. Raphael stopped him and said he wanted to hear from me first. I explained how Shane demanded I return to work 1 week after my C-section, called me lazy while I was bleeding and breastfeeding, told everyone I was milking the system, and even lied to my boss about me being ready to come back early. Raphael took notes and asked specific questions about dates and details. When did Shane first demand I return to work? What exact words did he use? How did I respond? What was my physical condition at the time? Shane shifted uncomfortably on the couch as I answered each question honestly. Raphael turned to Shane and asked him to explain his thinking during those first few weeks. Shane tried to say he was worried about money and didn't realize how serious my recovery needs were. Raphael asked directly if Shane had demanded I work, while I still had a catheter from surgical complications. Shane admitted yes. Raphael asked if Shane had called me lazy while I was breastfeeding our newborn. Shane said yes, but he was frustrated and didn't mean it that way. Raphael asked if Shane had contacted my employer without my permission to say I was ready to return early. Shane nodded and said he thought he was helping. Raphael set down his pen and looked at Shane for a long moment before speaking again. He said Shane's behavior fit clear patterns of postpartum partner resentment that could become abusive if not addressed properly. Shane's face went pale and he said he wasn't abusive. He was just stressed about finances. Raphael was firm and said coercing someone to work while they were medically unable was a form of control and harm, regardless of Shane's intentions or stress levels. I started crying during the session when Raphael validated that what I experienced wasn't normal relationship conflict, but actual mistreatment. Hearing someone outside our marriage say those words made something break open inside me. I'd been so focused on defending myself and proving my recovery was real that I hadn't let myself feel how badly Shane had hurt me. Raphael handed me tissues and waited while I composed myself. Shane looked devastated sitting next to me on the couch, but Raphael told him that feeling bad wasn't enough. He needed to understand why he felt entitled to override my medical needs and treat me like my pain and limitations weren't real. Shane tried to explain about his grandmother working through 6 pregnancies and his mother's opinions about modern women being too soft. Raphael cut him off and said those were excuses, not reasons. The real question was why Shane chose to believe outdated family stories instead of his wife's direct experience and multiple doctors' medical advice. Raphael gave us homework before we left that first session. Shane had to research postpartum recovery and write down everything he learned. I had to write down what I needed from Shane to begin rebuilding trust. Raphael said we both had to be completely honest even if it was uncomfortable or hard to hear. He scheduled our next appointment for the following Tuesday and told us to come prepared to discuss both assignments. The drive home was quiet. Shane stared out the window and I focused on the road. Ella slept in her car seat the whole way back. Shane spent the next few days working on his research assignment. I'd find him on his laptop late at night reading medical articles and taking notes. He printed out information about C-section recovery and highlighted sections. He watched videos about breastfeeding challenges and postpartum hormone changes. By Sunday night, he had a 5-page typed document that he showed me nervously. I read through it and saw details about abdominal muscle separation, internal healing timelines, blood loss complications, and the physical demands of round-the-clock newborn care. Shane had written notes in the margins about being shocked by what he was learning. At the bottom of the last page, he'd written that he was completely ignorant about all of this and wished he'd done this research 5 weeks ago. My trust rebuilding list was harder to write. I had to be honest about what I needed, and that meant admitting how deeply Shane had damaged my faith in him. I wrote that Shane needed to take full responsibility with his family for what happened and stop letting his mother blame me. He needed to never again comment on my work timeline or suggest I wasn't contributing enough. He needed to handle all household tasks until my doctor medically cleared me for normal activity. He needed to attend every remaining counseling session without complaint, and he needed to accept that I might need significant time to forgive him, because trust doesn't rebuild overnight just because someone finally understands they were wrong. I printed the list and put it in my purse for Tuesday's session. Our second counseling session started with Raphael reviewing both assignments. He read Shane's research document carefully and said it was thorough and showed genuine effort to understand. Then he read my trust rebuilding list and nodded at several points. He told Shane the research was good, but the real test would be sustained behavior change, not just temporary guilt-driven effort that faded when the crisis passed. He'd seen many couples where one partner made big changes for a few weeks, and then slowly reverted back to old patterns once things calmed down. Raphael asked Shane directly what he would do differently when the next stressful situation happened, because marriage involved many challenges and the pattern of blaming me under pressure would destroy our relationship if it continued. Shane struggled to answer beyond promising he'd do better and try harder. Raphael pushed him to be more specific. What would Shane do when he felt overwhelmed or resentful again? What would he do if money got tight or work got stressful? What would he do the next time life didn't go according to plan? Shane sat there trying to find words that didn't sound empty. He finally said he didn't know yet, but he was committed to figuring it out, which was at least honest, even if it wasn't the confident answer Raphael wanted to hear. And I raised my hand during the session and told Raphael something I hadn't let myself think about before. I said sometimes I missed our old life too, the one where Shane and I could sleep past 7 and go out for dinner without planning it days ahead and have conversations that weren't interrupted by crying. I missed feeling like myself instead of just someone's milk supply. I missed having energy and wearing clothes that fit right and feeling like I had control over my own body and schedule. Shane's attacks had made me so defensive about everything related to motherhood that I'd buried those feelings deep down, acting like every moment with Ella was perfect, when honestly some moments were just exhausting and lonely and kind of boring. Shane sat forward when I said this, looking surprised. Raphael nodded and asked Shane if he heard what I was saying. Shane said yes, but he didn't think I felt that way because I always seemed so focused on Ella and never complained about the hard parts. I told him I couldn't complain because every time I mentioned being tired or overwhelmed, he acted like I was being dramatic or using the baby as an excuse. He'd made it unsafe for me to be honest about struggling. Raphael helped us talk through the parts of new parenthood we'd both been too scared to say out loud. Shane admitted he felt trapped sometimes, like his whole life had become work and diapers with nothing fun or spontaneous anymore. He said he loved Ella, but missed feeling like he mattered to me, and he resented how the baby got all my attention while he felt invisible. I told him those feelings were normal, but they didn't give him permission to be cruel. We were both exhausted and overwhelmed, and sometimes resentful of how much our lives had changed, but healthy people talked about those feelings instead of attacking each other. Raphael said this was the most honest conversation we'd had in weeks, and that acknowledging the hard parts didn't make us bad parents. It made us realistic ones who could actually support each other instead of pretending everything was fine while secretly drowning. By week 9 postpartum, Shane and I had worked out new routines that felt less like constant crisis management. He handled mornings with Ella, getting up with her at 6 so I could sleep until 7:30, which doesn't sound like much, but that extra 90 minutes made a huge difference in how I felt all day. I took over evenings, so Shane could decompress from work for an hour without immediately having to deal with baby care. We traded off the night wakings, switching every other night so neither of us was completely destroyed all the time. The division wasn't perfect, and some days one of us ended up doing more than planned, but we were at least trying to be fair instead of Shane just assuming I should handle everything because I was home. He still sometimes looked exhausted and frustrated, especially when Ella had a rough night, but he wasn't directing that frustration at me anymore. He'd complain to me about being tired instead of complaining about me being home, which was a small but important difference. My mom came over on a Saturday afternoon and found Shane giving Ella a bath while I folded laundry. She watched him for a minute, being gentle with Ella and talking to her in a soft voice, then pulled me into the kitchen. She said Shane seemed like a completely different person than 3 weeks ago, when she'd found me crying and trying to work from bed. I told her he was trying really hard and going to counseling without fighting about it, but I was still watching carefully to see if these changes lasted when things got stressful again. I wasn't ready to fully trust that this version of Shane was permanent, because people could fake being better for a while and then slide back into old patterns once they thought the crisis had passed. My mom said that was smart and not to let my guard down just because he was doing the bare minimum of being a decent partner. She reminded me that what he'd done in those first 3 weeks was serious enough that I'd have been justified in leaving, and that staying meant he needed to prove himself for months, not just weeks. Shane's boss called him on Monday while we were eating dinner. I could hear the conversation from the kitchen where I was warming up Ella's bottle. His boss made some joke about me finally coming back to work soon, and how Shane must be excited to have his wife earning again. Shane went quiet for a second, and I braced myself for him to laugh along or make an excuse. Instead, he said clearly that I'd return when medically appropriate and that the jokes weren't funny. He told his boss that I was recovering from major surgery and that comments about my timeline were inappropriate. His boss sounded surprised and said he was just kidding around. Shane said he understood, but that he needed his boss to stop because it was disrespectful to me and to what our family was going through. After he hung up, Shane came into the kitchen looking nervous, like he wasn't sure if he'd done the right thing. I was shocked because I'd never heard him stand up to his boss about anything, let alone about me. I told him I'd heard the conversation and that it meant a lot that he'd shut it down instead of going along with it. 2 days later, I was in the bedroom putting away laundry when I heard Shane on the phone in the living room. His voice was firm in a way I wasn't used to hearing when he talked to his mother. I moved closer to the doorway so I could hear better. He was telling her that she needed to apologize to me for calling me selfish and saying I was refusing to work. His mother's voice came through the phone loud enough that I could hear her saying she was just being honest and that someone needed to tell me the truth. Shane said no. Someone needed to tell her that her behavior was unacceptable and that if she wanted to see Ella, she'd need to apologize and keep her opinions about my recovery to herself. His mother started crying, using that guilt trip voice she always used when Shane tried to set boundaries. She said she was just trying to help and that he was being cruel to his own mother. Shane didn't back down. He told her he loved her, but that she'd been cruel to his wife during the hardest time of her life, and that wasn't okay no matter what she believed about how women should handle childbirth. He said to call him back when she was ready to apologize properly. Then he hung up. I stood in the doorway staring at him because in 5 years together I'd never seen him stand up to his mother like that. She'd always gotten her way by crying and guilting him until he gave in. He looked up and saw me watching. He asked if I'd heard the whole thing. I nodded and told him I was proud of him for not backing down when she cried. Shane's mother sent a text 3 days later. Shane showed it to me on his phone. The message said she was sorry if I felt hurt by her comments, and that she hoped we could move past this for Ella's sake. It was one of those apologies that wasn't really an apology, the kind where someone says sorry you felt that way instead of sorry I did that. Shane knew it was weak, but he said it was probably the best we'd get from her, and that it was at least progress that she'd acknowledged anything at all. He texted back that she could visit briefly on Sunday if she kept her opinions to herself and was respectful. I appreciated him trying, even though I knew his mother would probably never truly understand why what she'd said was so harmful. Some people just couldn't admit they were wrong, especially about things they'd believed their whole lives. At my 10-week checkup, the doctor examined my incision and said it had healed well enough that I could return to work at 12 weeks as originally planned. She pressed on my abdomen, checking for pain, and asked about my energy levels and whether I was still bleeding. I told her the bleeding had finally stopped, and that I felt stronger than I had a month ago, but still got tired easily. She said that was completely normal, and that I should start with reduced hours if my job allowed it. She told me to listen to my body's signals about fatigue and stress, and that if I felt overwhelmed or noticed any pain, I should pull back and give myself more time. She wrote a note for my employer recommending a gradual return to full-time work over 4 weeks, starting at about 30 hours a week and building up. I took the note and felt both relieved and nervous about going back to the office after 3 months away. I emailed Sylvia Gonzalez in HR that afternoon to discuss my return timeline. She called me back within an hour and said she was glad to hear from me and that the company was excited to have me back. I explained what my doctor had recommended about reduced hours and asked if that would be possible. Sylvia said absolutely, and that she could arrange for me to work 3/4 time for the first month back, which would be 30 hours a week instead of my usual 40. She said I could adjust my schedule however worked best, whether that meant shorter days or taking Fridays off. She also said if I needed to pump during the day, there was a private room set up for that and I should just let her know my schedule. Her support made me feel less anxious about returning, because I'd been worried the company would be annoyed about accommodations. Sylvia said they valued me and wanted to make sure my transition back was manageable, which was exactly what I needed to hear. Shane and I spent the following Saturday visiting daycares for Ella. We'd made appointments at 3 different places that had good reviews and openings for infants. Shane came to all 3 visits instead of making me handle it alone, which I'd half expected him to do. At the first place, he asked questions about caregiver-to-baby ratios and how they handled feeding schedules. At the second place, he wanted to know about their safety protocols and what their policy was if a baby got sick. At the third place, he asked about their staff turnover rate and how long the current teachers had been working there. His questions were thoughtful and showed he'd actually researched what to look for in childcare. I watched him interact with the staff and take notes on his phone, and it felt like he was genuinely invested in making sure Ella would be safe and well cared for. This wasn't him just going through the motions to look good. He actually cared about getting this right. We ended up picking the place near my office that had the best ratio of caregivers to babies and a separate room just for infants. Shane filled out all the forms that night at our kitchen table while I fed Ella, asking me questions about her schedule and making notes about her feeding times. He called them the next day to put down the deposit and set up her start date for the week I was supposed to go back. He told me he wanted to handle this part so I could focus on getting ready to return to work and not stress about the paperwork. I appreciated it, but also watched carefully to make sure he actually followed through instead of just saying he would. He did everything he promised and even scheduled a walkthrough visit for us the week before my return date so we could see the room where Ella would spend her days. My first morning back at the office in week 12 felt strange walking through the building without being pregnant or recovering. My coworkers welcomed me back and asked to see pictures of Ella, though I noticed a few people glancing at me oddly like they were remembering something. My boss called me into his office and told me he was glad I was back and that he'd keep my project load light for the first few weeks while I adjusted. He was professional and supportive, but I could tell he hadn't forgotten about Shane's weird call 3 months ago. A couple people from Shane's department made small talk with me in the break room, and I wondered what Shane had told them about our situation and whether they were watching to see if I seemed unstable or difficult. Shane and I kept going to see Raphael every Wednesday evening even though things were calmer now. I asked Raphael if we really needed to keep coming since we weren't fighting anymore, and things felt manageable. Raphael said this was exactly when we needed to keep coming, because doing the work during calm times prevented us from falling back into old patterns when stress hit again. He said couples who only came during crisis never built lasting change because they stopped working on things as soon as they felt better. Shane agreed we should keep the appointments and said he didn't want to risk going back to how things were in those first few weeks. 3 months after having Ella, Shane and I had figured out a routine that worked, even though it wasn't perfect. He still got frustrated sometimes about how much our lives had changed and how tired we both were all the time. But now he talked to me about feeling overwhelmed instead of blaming me for everything wrong in his life. I had learned to tell him directly when something wasn't okay, instead of hoping he'd figure it out on his own. We were both exhausted from the constant cycle of feeding and changing and soothing, and some days we barely had energy to talk to each other beyond coordinating who was handling what task. But we were splitting everything fairly now and making decisions together about Ella's care. I knew I'd need to stay alert about keeping these changes in place because old habits could come back easily under pressure. But for now, we were actually functioning as partners instead of me doing everything while he complained.